But we're going to be kicking off this hour with a conversation with New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator fresh off of that vote on President Biden's $1.9 trillion economic relief package. We saw it pass the Senate over the weekend, but it passed without a single Republican lawmaker voting for the bill. I spoke to the senator earlier today and started the conversation by asking her whether she was concerned that that partisan vote would make some of her other legislative priorities more difficult to pass in the months ahead.
I'm not concerned at all because the American people on a bipartisan basis asked for this relief. Unfortunately, our Republican colleagues were unwilling to send money to states, localities, cities, and that was some of the most essential resources that we put forward for our frontline workers. This is what pays for the nurses and the doctors and the EMTs, the police officers and the firefighters, the teachers, the school budgets. Those are the things that were absolutely necessary to get our schools open, which as a working mom, I understand how urgent that is for every parent in America. We needed to make sure that we had the resources to vaccinate all the teachers, all the adults, all the first line workers, all the older Americans, and anyone who's vulnerable. We had to make sure it had resources to have supplemental healthcare workers. One of the things I worked on was the health force, because our doctors and nurses are taxed to the end. They are so exhausted. And so we need a whole new group of workers to do the vaccination so that they can be sent out quickly and effectively, getting more shots in arms more quickly.
One of the key things missing from this bill, though, is a minimum wage hike on the federal level. A number of your colleagues in the Senate have suggested alternative routes to get there. You had the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer suggesting penalizing large corporations who don't raise their wages to $15 an hour. Your colleague, Senator Wyden, suggested potential tax credits to small businesses so they can afford to pay for higher wages. Is there a viable path forward if you've got at least 8 Democratic senators who've already publicly opposed a wage hike on the federal level?
Well, a couple good things. In the bill that we passed, we had $7 billion for small businesses for the PPP program. We also had $25 billion for restaurants, something that I worked really hard to make sure that they're there when the pandemic is over, that they're still standing. And another $1.25 billion for venue operators, places like music halls and places like Broadway and venues in upstate New York for concerts. All that really mattered. So because we put a lot of resources forward for our small businesses, they may be able to pay their workers more. I don't know if we'll have enough votes to get to a $15 minimum wage, which is a shame because I don't think anyone should be working a full-time job and still living in poverty. And so we want to make sure that our lowest wage workers are earning a living wage so they can provide for their children, make sure their children are eating and getting the clothing and the school and the opportunities that they need. But without a higher minimum wage, a lot of workers just, they're working 2 and 3 jobs, working more than full time just to literally put food on their table. So it's just a shame. It doesn't mean it's not over. It means we have to keep advocating and explaining what these workers' lives are like and explaining why this investment matters so much now.
Let's talk about what's playing out in your home state of New York. You've got the Governor Andrew Cuomo under fire for sexual harassment allegations made by former members of his staff. You've also got allegations of administration covering up the number of COVID-related deaths in nursing homes. I know you have pushed for an investigation. You've called the allegations unacceptable, but now you've got the state majority leader, as well as the House Speaker, calling for his resignation immediately. Do these recent developments change your perspective on what should happen next?
Well, obviously, you have 2 different types of concerns. With regard to the nursing home scandal, it's a big issue because a lot of older Americans have borne the brunt of COVID-19, and we've seen far too many deaths than we would ever want to see. And so that is something that I'm hoping to look at in my role on the Aging Committee, because the very high death rates for older Americans living in assisted living facilities was high in all the states. It wasn't just left to New York. And so I hope to have oversight and accountability over that larger issue. across the country, and I'm going to work on that. That's obviously something that's been investigated in our state and created concerns for many people. But my job is just to make sure that going forward, we don't create unnecessary risks for older Americans, but also have the protections in place to protect them in the future. With regard to the, do you want me to address the other question?
Yes.
With regard to the sexual harassment allegations, there are now 5 women who have come forward with credible allegations. These are serious allegations, and for every woman that comes forward to tell their story, it takes courage, and it's very hard to do. And so I am supporting them in making sure that they get a full investigation. Tish James, our Attorney General, has asked not only for the authority to do it, but has been given that. And so now she can do the thorough investigation with subpoena power, which I think is the appropriate next steps.
Do you think the governor should resign immediately?
Well, the governor's already said he does not intend to do so. But again, asking every female elected in our state when a person should resign or not resign really isn't the conversation we should be having. And I have to say, it's exceedingly frustrating because so many men who are also in public leadership aren't asked these questions day to day. The women in our state are not meant to be judges, jurors, and executioners. Our job is to protect people in the workplace, which is why I work so hard to change the standards. In the federal government, we did not have a process to deal with sexual harassment in Congress. And so I worked with others to write those rules to protect men and women in the workplace from sexual harassment. I've also worked on the federal level to make sure that when a worker goes to work somewhere, they don't have to automatically sign their rights away through these mandatory non-disclosure agreements, so that when they are sexual harassed, when they do report it, they're then muzzled and refuse to be able to speak out about it because they've signed these unfair agreements. And so that is my job, to protect as many people as I can and to set standards that are better. But we are not meant to be the people who judge everyone. And I really resent the fact that that what the news media calls on every woman elected to do every single time. And unfortunately, what it does is then turn the spotlight on the women of the state when they should be squarely on the individuals who are being accused of sexual harassment.
We're talking here on International Women's Day, and of course, there's been so much focus throughout the pandemic on the disproportionate impact this has had on working women. When you look at the bill that was passed over the weekend, it includes a child tax credit providing parents with monthly checks up to $300 per child. How big of a priority is it for you to make this permanent in the months ahead?
So this is one of the most ambitious investments in this $1 trillion package, to make sure that every working parent is getting $300 per child per month. Will go a long way to putting food on the table. It will go a long way to helping meet the needs of children whose needs, frankly, aren't being met right now because so many parents are out of work and don't have access to an income to protect their families. And so I think it's very important. The other piece of this legislation that I worked hard on was a paid leave provision to make sure paid leave is there during the entire course of this pandemic. But one of my goals is to make paid leave permanent, because we are still the only industrialized country in the world without access to paid leave, and most workers do not have access. And what that means is they have to choose between going to work and providing income and resources for their families and meeting their family's needs. And so for a lot of workers, particularly single parents, having to choose between staying home to watch their child remote learn and help their child remote learn or go to work has been an unfair decision that they've been very difficult to make. And some don't even have that choice because their industry has been closed and they have no paid leave to stay on payroll there. So if we had had paid leave, this pandemic would not be as nearly damaging as it's been for women in the workplace and for parents in the workplace, because they've been bearing double burdens: elderly parents, young children, their own health, trying to get to work and trying to have children be schooled at home. It's nearly impossible, if not impossible, but it would have been a lot easier if we'd had paid leave.
Yeah, and the issue of paid leave, something you've been championing for more than a decade. A final question we've been asking to all of our guests on International Women's Day, which is, how do you get to gender parity in your perspective or individual sectors? We're talking about politics with you. What do you think is going to be the key change to getting there?
So one of the efforts I've made since 2010 is a political action committee called Off the Sidelines. And the purpose of that political action is to call women, to ask them to, number one, vote, to ask them to run for office, and if they're not willing to run for office, to support a woman who is willing to run for office. And through that effort over the last decade, I've raised over $10 million for women candidates, and it's made a difference. We've been able to historically elect more women in the last few elections than ever before. And we are slowly getting close to parity. We still only have approximately 25% of women in Congress. We need that number to get to 51%. Until we represent the actual population of our country, our work is simply not done. And so we just have to keep working on asking women to run, asking other women and men to support those female candidates, and to create the oversight and accountability we need in the federal government so that all these issues that we talked about today, from child care tax credits, poverty relief, money for food stamps and pandemic EBT, money for paid leave, these are the kinds of reforms that the country desperately needs. And more often than not, it is women that see these problems and offer these new, robust, and more far-reaching solutions.
New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand there speaking to us earlier. Thanks to her for joining us for that conversation.